So this is the first video in a series that I'm starting in which I'm going to bake things that I've never baked before, and hopefully I'll be able to document any mistakes that I make so that if you try this recipe, you won't have to make them. Today we're going to start with bagels. Now I've looked into at least a dozen different bagel recipes, and I've also done some research into the techniques that make a nice, chewy, New York style bagel. I've kind of mashed up all the info I've gathered into a recipe that I think anybody could make. So we're gonna start with some warm water. And this water needs to be warm so that we can proof our yeast. We'll add in our yeast along with some sugar. Then we're gonna let that sit for about 10 minutes. And after that time, your yeast should be making bubbles. This lets us know that the yeast is ready to use in our dough. So we can grab our flour and add in the salt. Then give that a mix to disperse it into the flour and add in your yeasty water. You can mix this with a fork if you'd like, but this dough is very stiff, so I just decided to use my hands. We do need this dough to be stiff so that we can get that chew in our bagels. I used all-purpose flour here because it's what I had on hand, but you could also use bread flour and get an even better texture. Once you've got that all mixed, we need to let this rest for 10 minutes before we knead it to allow the flour to hydrate. If we allow the flour to hydrate now, we'll be able to incorporate even more flour as we knead it. After 10 minutes, you're going to generously flour your surface and dump the dough out and start kneading. Once the flour is absorbed, add more to the board. Keep adding flour until the dough no longer sticks to the board. This took about 5 minutes of kneading for me, and then we're going to knead it for at least another 5 minutes. Here's a new technique I learned, where you push the dough one way with one hand, and then you push it the other way with the other hand. We're kneading this to develop gluten. Gluten is essentially a network of proteins that provide structure to baked goods. In this case, we want a lot of gluten to give us that chew that we're after in these bagels. Now to test if your dough has developed enough gluten, you're going to try and stretch it so thin that you can see light through it. If it tears before that, knead it for another couple minutes. It took me about 12 minutes to get to this point. Then we can oil a bowl and place our dough in to rise. Cover it with a damp tea towel and let this rise for 45 minutes to an hour or until it's doubled in size. Then we need to punch it down to knock some of that air out. Now you might be wondering why we're knocking out all the air that we just waited an hour for the yeast to produce. Well, a majority of the air will be knocked out, but those bubbles that the yeast made will stay there and expand slightly when we cook them, which will give us our desired texture. But anyway, you're going to divide your dough into 8 pieces and then we can start shaping them. You're going to fold the edges of your dough into the middle and pinch them together. Then you're going to flip the dough so that the seam is on the bottom. You're going to use the slight stickiness of the dough to form a nice tight ball by gently rolling the seam around your board. Now I'm going to show you 3 shaping methods today: the poke method, the rope method, and the 2-strand method. So if you want to use the poke method, you can stop here. But if you want to use the rope or the 2-strand method, you're going to want to shape your dough ball into a little log. Then I'm going to let these rest for 10 minutes to let the gluten relax and make these easier for us to shape. We'll start with the poke method. It's the easiest one because all you need to do is poke a hole in the middle and then carefully stretch it out, trying to keep all the sides even. Next, we'll do the rope method. Roll your dough into a rope about 8 inches long and then put your hands on the ends and twist them in opposite directions. From what I've gathered, this twisting motion is going to give us even more chew in our bagel. Then you're going to wrap that around your hand and pinch the seam together. This process gets easier with each bagel, but even if they don't look great now, they'll look just fine when they come out of the oven. And last but not least is the 2-strand method. For this, you're going to cut your log in half, then roll both halves to about 8 inches in length, and then you're going to stick them together and give them a twist. When they are sufficiently twisted, you're going to use the same wraparound motion as the last one. Make sure the seam is pinched really tightly because these are more prone to coming undone when we boil them. Whatever method you choose, you're going to cover your shaped bagels with that tea towel again and let them rise for 45 more minutes. When there are 20 minutes left in your rise, put a pot of water to boil. I'm adding 16 grams of both salt and baking soda and 32 grams of brown sugar. So I'm going to go into the science of why we boil these before we bake them. If you're not interested in that, you can skip to this time. So why do we boil bagels before we bake them? Boiling these is going to cook the exterior just enough so that when we put them in the oven, they won't expand. This makes sure that the air bubbles don't get too big, and in turn, the interior is going to remain dense, but in a pleasant way. Now, you can boil these in plain water, but we added salt, baking soda, and brown sugar. We add in the salt just to season the water, but the baking soda has a very specific purpose. What this will do is change the pH of the outside of our bagel, and having a higher pH will aid in browning. Now, I added in the brown sugar in place of barley malt syrup because I don't have that. But the brown sugar will do the job just fine. You could also add honey instead. The molasses in the brown sugar is going to add depth of flavor to our bagels. I think these add-ins really contribute to the flavor of the bagels. But after they've risen, you're going to carefully lower one into the water and let it cook for 1 minute before flipping it and cooking for another minute. Then you're going to take out your bagel with a slotted spoon so that it can drip off a little before we put it on our baking sheet. I line mine with parchment paper because I'm not a fan of the texture that the cornmeal gives to the bottom of the bagel, but if that doesn't bother you, you can sprinkle on 2 tablespoons of cornmeal instead. After they cool a bit after coming out of the water, they get this weird wrinkly look. But in the oven, those wrinkles are gonna turn into these little micro bubbles that give the crust an amazing texture. So after you've got them all boiled, we can top them. I wanted to top mine with a little everything bagel seasoning, but my jar was almost empty. So I took a look at the ingredients and decided to make my own. I already had everything on hand besides the poppy seeds, so I added some sesame seeds, black sesame seeds, minced onion, garlic powder, black pepper, and some flaky sea salt. I know there's a bunch of recipes for this stuff out there, but I'll leave the amounts that I used in the description down below. So if you'd like, you can brush these with an egg wash, but I'm keeping these vegan, so I just brush them with a little olive oil to help our topping stick. The great thing about making your own bagels is that you can add as much or as little of this as you'd like. You can also season these however you want. For a few of these, I'm brushing on some of the oil from this jar of sun-dried tomatoes and topping with equal parts garlic salt, dried rosemary, and dried basil. So I got all the seasoning sprinkled on, and then I left this one plain with no oil just to see how it would affect the browning. These go into a 425-degree oven for 15 to 17 minutes. When they come out of the oven, you can put them on a cooling rack or just let them cool on the tray for 15 minutes, and then they're ready to eat. So I'll show you the result of each shaping method. The first one is the rope method. This one turned out a little bit thin, but that's my fault, not the bagels. This one is the poke method, and this one is the 2-strand method. And I think this one ended up being the prettiest. And here's the one that I didn't brush with any oil, and surprisingly, it browned just as well as the others did. So here's a shot to give you a closer look at those micro bubbles on the outside of the bagel. Let's take a look at the inside. As you can see, there are a few large air pockets, but for the most part, there's a bunch of tiny, small bubbles. And to give you a better idea of the texture, I'll tear the top of this one and give it a bite. It's nice and chewy, but it has enough air in it to prevent it from being dense in an unpleasant way. So what can we do with these? I sliced up some avocado and bell pepper, and then I sliced one of my everything bagels in half and piled them on top. I finished this one with a little balsamic vinegar, and it was delicious, but it does look a little flat. So let's make a sandwich, piled high on a toasted rosemary and basil one. I started by laying down some sweet potato. And if you're looking to up your vegan or vegetarian sandwich game, sweet potato is the way to go. Then I added some bell pepper, lettuce, and baked tofu. Then I topped it with avocado and the top of my bagel, which I smeared with some vegan mayo. Then there's my favorite way, which is just with some butter and a cup of tea. So thanks for learning how to make bagels with me, and if you like what I do here, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.